Thank you. There he is. Thank you, Philip, and Mr. Franke, thank you. I wasn't out here to applaud you. I was applauding back there. And congratulations to everyone involved in the Chicago Humanities Festival. This is my third time speaking at the festival. I don't remember exactly which years they were, but it's been 2 previous books. Each time it's been very special. And now I've graduated to the Field Museum. Wow. Woo! I spent a good piece of my career here in the Chicago area. I love Chicago. My first job out of graduate school was out at North Central College in Naperville. I know, oh my gosh, right. But God, I was thrilled to have that job. I really was. I was totally thrilled. And I would come into Chicago almost every weekend. Anyway, I'm here to talk about Mr. D and why one would do a book on him. And since the theme of this year's festival is all about power, I, of course, came armed with a quotation. Douglass is so eminently quotable, and this probably is his most famous quote, although there are plenty of others that should be more famous. And if enough people keep reading my book, maybe something else will come out. But you've heard it before. Without struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. He understood power. He didn't have a lot of it. In fact, the only real power Frederick Douglass ever had was words. Words were his weapon. Words were the only real power Douglass ever possessed. I'll come back to that. Now, but first, let me spend just a minute or two on why one would do a new biography of Frederick Douglass. Many of you are history readers, or you wouldn't be here tonight. And you probably know other things have been written about Douglass by literary scholars, by historians, and others. And the truth is, though I had done my dissertation at Wisconsin on Douglass, it was my first book, a much narrower study of Douglass and the meaning of the Civil War. I had edited editions of his first 2 autobiographies, I'd written essays on Douglass, and a bunch of other things. And Douglass had been some piece of virtually every other book I've ever done. I had Douglass out of my life. He was gone. And I was fine with that. Until 12 years ago, I went to Savannah, Georgia, of all places you might think, to give a talk, yet another talk, on Frederick Douglass's narrative, his first autobiography, to middle school and high school teachers, which I've done many times, and I love doing that, because they teach the narrative. And as I arrived, my host was the Georgia Historical Society, and their leader said, there's a local gentleman here in Savannah who's a collector, and he'd like to have lunch with you. And apparently my response, I don't remember, was something like, I guess so, which was inappropriate and stupid of me. But to make a long story short, that day I met Walter Evans, and I apologize for any of you who have heard me tell this story before on YouTube or elsewhere. But Walter is an African-American retired surgeon who grew up in segregated Savannah, went north for his higher education, Howard University in Washington as an undergraduate, and to the University of Michigan Medical School. And then he practiced in Detroit for nearly 35 years as a general surgeon and did very well at it. That immediately gave us something in common, because I grew up in Flint, Michigan, lifetime Tigers fan, as is Walter. It's been rough lately. I can't stand watching the World Series and seeing all the former Tiger pitchers for both teams. You're watching the former starting rotation of the Tigers in the World Series. Let's not go there, though. Anyway, but Walter's great passion in life, other than making a great living in surgery, was collecting. He started collecting back in the 1970s and 80s. He collects African-American rare books, manuscripts, and art. His art collection is probably even much better known than his manuscripts and rare books. But he has an amazing collection. It is almost all in his house in Savannah, at least for now. We are making arrangements at Yale University for his Douglass collection, although he's a heck of a businessman, and that's taken a while. He's a great businessman, actually. Anyway, Walter that day took me over to his house, which is a big, beautiful 4-story brownstone, and got out on his dining room table a portion of his Frederick Douglass collection, the core of which, there are many, many things in it, but the core of which are 9 family scrapbooks, huge scrapbooks that were kept by 2 of Douglass's sons over the last 30 years of their father's life, 30, 35 years, really. And I had by no means decided on the spot, oh, destiny has struck, I must write this book. Yeah. No, I took months to make up my mind because it was very daunting. This is a long and epic life. But I finally did decide that if I don't do this, somebody else will. I wasn't the first to see the Evans material, but I was the first to use it. And I'll leave it there. But if you read the book, you'll note that all over the footnotes, especially the last third of the book, actually the second half of the book, the Evans collection is everywhere. And here's what it did, and then I'll leave that. It opened up Frederick Douglass's post-Civil War life, the older Douglass, the aging Douglass, the Douglass after emancipation. It opened up that part of his life as never before to scholars. And there have now been several other historians who've made the pilgrimage to Savannah, gone through Walter's initiation, and had the privilege to work in the most amazing archive I've ever worked in, which is Walter and Linda's dining room table. They only had 2 rules for me. One was never come before 8 a.m., which was fine, and never put your coffee cup on the same table with the documents. Fine. And Linda used to sometimes make lunch for me. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. Blind, crazy good luck is the reason I did this new biography. 12 years after encountering the Evans collection. But that latter part of Douglass's life, that's not the Douglass most Americans know anything about. If Americans know Douglass at all, they tend to know that young Douglass, because a lot of young people now have grown up reading the narrative. They know about the heroic slave, former slave who escapes. They know about maybe the young orator who becomes this most remarkable orator in the American reform world. They might know something about his role in the period of the Civil War, but they don't know that older Douglass. He seems to be less interesting then. He's an aging man. He might have fallen out of touch or something. That Douglass is equally interesting, and to me, in some ways, took over the book. That might be because I'm aging and I got interested in his aging, but he becomes the patriarch of a huge extended family, 4 adult surviving children, 21 grandchildren, 3 fictive siblings at one time or another who adopted him and he adopted them, and always a variety of other hangers-on around Douglass after he moved to Washington in particular in 1872. It's the Douglass who is the old radical outsider who becomes a political insider after emancipation, after the Civil War. What happens to an old radical when he actually gets at least 1 foot in the door of some kind of power inside the Republican Party? 3 significant appointments to federal offices. That older Douglass never stopped speaking, never stopped writing. He sustained back-breaking, mind-numbing lecture tours year after year after year until he was 76 years old. He never stopped the lecture circuit. In fact, in the book, I speculate that he may have traveled more miles than any American of the 19th century, with the possible exception of Mark Twain. Twain was always on the road, and Twain cheated. He went to Asia. It's one of the reasons Douglass may be the most photographed American of the 19th century. He was always on the road, and everywhere he went, the local photographer wanted him to sit for a photograph, and he was very happy to do so. The older Douglass is an equally fascinating person to that younger, heroic Douglass. But what makes this life compelling, and how do you, as a biographer, a scholar, impose some order on it? How do you put an epic life like this in some order? And that is what we do. I had a method in this biography that kind of happened to me as much as I came up with it, and it's really ingenious. It says, tell the story in the order it happened. It's a great theory. Let the episodes and pivots of the life dictate the divisions into chapters and so on. Tell it as it happened. I also had another method, which is basic to biography now, I think, and that is to tell the public and the private story of this man's life in tandem, always trying to do it together. And there's no chapter in the book that is just the public man. No chapter in the book that says, okay, now it'll be about his 2 wives, or this chapter is about his children, or this chapter is... No, because we don't live our lives that way. You get up every day and you live both your... If you have a public life, or for that matter, if you have a job, you live your public life and your private life every day. And sometimes one really impinges on the other. That's what biographers have to find and weave it together. That's really a highfalutin theory too, isn't it? Well, there you are. Now, why a biography of Douglass, though? Well, I told you, new sources. But this is an epic life. He's born in a backwater of the American slave system. He was born along a horseshoe bend in the Tuckahoe River in February 1818 out on the eastern shore of Maryland. If he had never been sent to Baltimore, where he got to live 9 out of his 20 years as a slave, we wouldn't know about him. He might have escaped from the eastern shore. There were other famous fugitive slaves who did, like Harriet Tubman. But that was not as likely as it was for him to escape from Baltimore, a maritime city. But being born to a mother he did not really know, named Harriet Bailey, he last saw her when he was almost 6, but he had virtually no memory of her, and he had to invent memories of her. And with no father he could ever really determine. All he knew is that his father was white and probably one of his 2 masters or owners, but he never knew that for sure either. He's an orphan, slave child. How did he get from there to the greatest lecture halls in the Western world? How did he get from the Eastern Shore to the lecture halls of Edinburgh and London and Naples and Glasgow and 125 other venues and just in the British Isles alone? How did he get from the Eastern Shore to that big house he had on the hill at Cedar Hill in Washington, D.C., where he could look down one side of the hill and see the U.S. Capitol and look in the other direction on a really clear day and see the Chesapeake? How did he get from one side of that Chesapeake to the other? And he's born before steamboats are out on the rivers. He's born before the telegraph, before the railroad, before the rotary press. all those great elements of early 19th century modernity that he would use to reshape his life and, in his own way, change the world. He's an editor for 16 years of his own newspaper. He traveled more miles on railroads than maybe anyone else in the century. But he's going to live all the way to 1895 when electric light bulbs are out there. You got the first internal combustion engines, all kinds of crazy gadgets that Thomas Edison and his laboratory is creating in New Jersey. And he lives to the age of the phonograph. Although so far, no one has ever found any evidence that his voice was recorded, which is a shame. And I don't think he ever was recorded because of a particular letter he wrote very late in his life, but that's another story. His life is across most of the 19th century, but in the middle of it, he became, in effect, America's prose poet. He became, above all, not just an orator, but a writer. And if Douglass were here today, I haven't quite been able to get him to tell me. But believe me, every biographer tries that. You know, come on, tell me. But if he were here today, the thing he'd be proudest of, I mean, in an interview, he'd probably say his sons or his children or his grandchildren or something, but pretty quickly he would say, I'm a writer. I was a slave who took this and told my story, and took this and wrote hundreds and hundreds of short-form political editorials. I was a writer who took this and wrote at least one novella. I was a writer who took this and wrote thousands of speeches, a bunch of which you still are reading. He wrote millions of words. And in those words, he had more to say about this greatest, deepest of American dilemmas: slavery, race, racism, the coming of the Civil War, the fighting of that war, America's Armageddon, the transformation of the United States, its Constitution, its republic, its institutions out of emancipation and Union victory, and then all the way through Reconstruction, the attempt to put the country back together under a whole new vision of egalitarian justice and equality before law in that 14th Amendment, and then still lives long enough to see it all coming apart because of Supreme Court decisions, because of terrorist violence, because of Jim Crow laws, and because of lynching. He's going to live all the way to 1895. He's going to interpret all of that history as virtually nobody else did. In prose. He did, by the way, actually write a fair amount of verse and poetry. It just wasn't his best mode. Prose poetry, however, yes. There are all kinds of paradoxes in Douglass's life which make him interesting. You know, anyone with a lot of paradoxes and contradictions is always good for biography, right? We like that because we know we have a few. Now, you impose order on a subject like this because it's the only way you can somehow do it without it becoming 1,000 pages. It became almost 800 anyway. Sorry about that. But the book has essentially 6 major themes, or 6 subjects that I made primary to the book, and I weave all of them, virtually all of them, throughout the book. One, I've already said, is simply words. Any biography of Frederick Douglass is the biography of his words. In fact, at one point, when we were playing with titles, I wanted, well, for about 3 minutes, I wanted to call the book Frederick Douglass, Biography of a Voice. And my editor at Simon & Schuster said, no. No. Too literary, you'll lose your audience. Doesn't sound right. He's right. But in some ways, it is a biography of a voice. He had an amazing facility with language. How does he get that? That's one of the things I try to deeply probe and explain in the book, from his slave days, how he came by literacy with his mistress, Sophia Auld, how he found and discovered the Columbian Order, this incredible and important school book that he discovered among his white playmates in the streets of Baltimore when he's 11 years old, and then he got his own copy of it, and he learned the techniques of oratory from it. He learned language and got language, in fact, in his head from the Bible. The language Douglass got into his head was the King James cadences of the Bible, and particularly from the Old Testament. For about 3 years in Baltimore, he used to sit with an old black preacher named Charles Lawson. Douglass called him Father Lawson or Uncle Lawson at times. This was a man who was a drayman by day. He drove a cart to try to make a living. He was a free man, but he was a Bible fanatic. And when he found this kid, 13, 14 years old, who could read so well, he sat him down. And according to Douglass, they just spent hours and hours and hours with Douglass reading the Old Testament out loud to Lawson. Now, what does a kid understand, about the Exodus story or about Genesis, or a kid reading Isaiah out loud? Who knows what he understands? There's a lot that's so confounding about the Old Testament, but the Old Testament became both source of language to Douglass and especially the source of stories. The second big theme is deeply related to the first, and that is his autobiographies. Douglass wrote 3 of them, and then revised the third one yet a 4th time. If you're a biographer, never trust anybody who writes 3 autobiographies. They're imposing themselves on you, in case you didn't notice. 1,200 pages of autobiography. He's perhaps the greatest memoirist of the 19th century, at least in America as well. He never stopped writing his own story. So in one sense, his autobiographies are both source and subject. You have to keep explaining, why does this man feel like or believe he has to keep writing his story? And then, of course, they are a source. They're a source of all kinds of information about his life, especially his slave youth. But they are also autobiographies that hide and obscure and cover all kinds of aspects of his life, especially almost anything private. You got to find that by other means. I could go on about either one of those, but the third big theme in the book, and I've signaled that too, is the Bible. I analyzed Douglass from a kind of biblical storytelling and to some degree theological sense more than any other biographer has. I don't claim any high ground with that. I just think it's very important. You can't read a Douglass speech without encountering usually 2, 3, 4, or a half dozen references to the Old Testament, phrases from Isaiah, phrases from Jeremiah, sometimes whole quotations from Ezekiel. Douglass learned storytelling from the Old Testament. And the greatest story of all animated him the most, Exodus. There's a reason the Exodus story, or something like it, exists in almost all cultures, but there's also a reason why Americans have been especially so proficient at claiming and adapting the Exodus story from various kinds of traditions. And after all, what is that Exodus story when you really boil it down? Well, it's the great Hebrew prophets warning the people, warning the Israelites. Your society is so poisoned. You are so corrupt. Your temple must be destroyed. It will be destroyed. God has his moment coming with you. And the moment comes. And a whole lot of them go into exile. It's an Egyptian exile. Some of them will survive that. Some of them won't. Some of them get through the Red Sea. Some of them don't. Some of them get to Sinai and get the law from Moses. Some of them will believe it and follow it. Some of them won't. Some of them will get to Babylonia and live through the Babylonian captivity, which may have been 40 years, 60 years, 80 years. They debate this. Nobody knows. And some of them will become Babylonians. But some of them, a few of them, will survive even that and go west and cross the Jordan. Moses won't get there, but they'll follow Joshua. They'll find something called a promised land. They'll find something called redemption. If you just listen to the basics of that story, you can see why Americans have fit themselves into that. Douglass will find in the Exodus story and in the Old Testament itself the story of his people, of his nation, and of himself. Now, I'll just say one other thing about that, the Bible theme. I was so anxious while writing this book about this part of the research and this part of the writing because I don't have any formal theological training. I wish I had. I wanted to take a year off and go to some monastery and just do daily study. I didn't have that. I had a year off. In fact, grace of God and fellowship heaven, I had a professorship at the University of Cambridge for a year in England where they didn't make me teach very much, and I wrote 8 chapters while I was there. I did a lot of reading of theology, too. I just started taking books off the shelves. But I did have a few friends who are theologians, and I'll spare you the personal stories about them, although I'd love to tell you. They helped me a lot. One of them is the former Donald Shriver. He's the former president of Union Theological Seminary in New York City. The other is a rabbi in New Haven, with whom I've become good friends, Jim Ponit, who retired as head rabbi at Yale and used to come and sit in the front row of my lecture class with his wife, Alana. We got to know each other. We had lunch with each other. He learned of my dilemma about Douglass, and he said, "David, sit down. You got to read this, you got to read that, you got to read Robert Alter, you got to read him, you got to read that, but you especially got to read Abraham Heschel." So to Heschel I went, and I read his book called The Prophets, published in the 1950s. Heschel was one of the greatest Jewish theologians ever. Wrote many, 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 many books. And some of you no doubt know Heschel's work. But it was Heschel as much as, and there were others, but it was Heschel especially that helped me get my head around just what is a prophet. What do prophets do? How should we actually use that word? Because I wanted to put prophet in the title of this book, but I was so nervous about that. It's a big word. You can't just throw it around like popcorn. You know, that's a big word if you're going to use it. You better know what you're talking about. It took me years to have any faith I could get away with it. And so far, the book's been out more than a year. No theologian has ripped this book apart yet. That's not an invitation to somebody here from the Garrett Theological Seminary to just, ooh, I'm going to buy that book. And one passage from Heschel. There are several that helped me, many that helped me, and 3 or 4 of them I quote in the book. But here's Heschel. "The prophet," he wrote, "is human. Yet he employs notes 1 octave too high for our ears. He experiences moments that defy our understanding. He is neither a singing saint nor a moralizing poet, but an assaulter of our minds. Often his words begin to burn where conscience ends. An assaulter of our minds. Finding words an octave higher than the rest of us can quite grasp." That's Douglass. He was a wielder of words. If you read Douglass at all, the speeches, political editorials, even the autobiographies, you will read passages, single sentences sometimes, paragraphs that'll just blast you between the eyes, and you'll think, oh my God, got to reread that. He had that ability to capture a historical moment, to capture a pivot in history, a catastrophe in history, a triumph in history, and make sense of it. That's why we have prophets, at least in this particular Western tradition. Prophets are not nice people. They're not usually people who are fun to have lunch with. They're not always right. They don't just predict things. In fact, prophets aren't here to predict. They're here to call us. They're here to warn us. They're here to explain to us, and they're rare. If you meet anybody who says they're a prophet, they're not. The last three big themes I'll go through very quickly. I've already mentioned one of them, and that is this political outsider. This radical outsider, the abolitionist, always on the outside of power of any kind, beating on the doors, delivering a radical critique of America, sometimes through a radical kind of patriotism, as in his famous 4th of July speech, but who becomes, because of this transformative event in the middle of his life, the Civil War and emancipation, slowly but surely a political insider. What happens to that person? What kind of deals do they end up making? What kind of compromises go on in the life, the work, and the soul of the old radical who becomes an insider? And right now you're already thinking of cases of this in our own lifetime. Think of all the great leaders of the civil rights movement who became mayors and congressmen and governors and senators. And then what's his name from here in Chicago, the young guy, community organizer, what's his name? You know, for a while, a lot of us forgot, you know, we were bitching at him and he was making this deal and that deal, and we forgot, oh God, the dude is president. How'd that happen? I got to meet Obama this summer. I almost didn't wash for a week. It was... You can't get away with that line in a lot of places in this country. But thank God you can in Chicago. His film company is adapting the book for a film, so that's how we... Anyway. Yeah, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. Lots of films get started and never get made, but we thought we had a good chance with them. Anyway, the fifth big theme is the public and the private. And how do you find the balance in writing up a life like this? And he had a very complicated, turbulent, tension-filled, and also love-filled private life. Adoring relationships with his 4 surviving adult children, although those children, all 4 of them, especially 3 of them, had very difficult lives professionally, personally. His son, Frederick Jr., died at age 51. 11 of his 21 grandchildren died in infancy or by their teenage years. He and Anna were always holding funerals at Cedar Hill. They had 4 grandchildren die in 1 month in a diphtheria epidemic in the 1880s. They did a collective mass funeral. He had 2 marriages, one of 44 years to Anna Murray Douglass, a free black woman in Baltimore whom he met as a teenager, fell in love with. She had the incredible bravery equal to his to follow him out of slavery. Anna never became literate. It's a very complex story. She never learned to read and write, although there were many, many efforts to help her. But his wife of 44 years, mother of his 5 children, their daughter Annie, her namesake, died at the age of 11, while Douglass was in Britain escaping the John Brown conspiracy. And then there are 2 significant relationships with European women, one named Julia Griffiths from England, one named Ottilia Assing from Germany. Teaser, I'm not going to go into them in any depth right now. Ooh. because I don't have time. There's a big clock up here, and I'm going to save time for Q&A. If one of you wants to ask about it, go right ahead. But the public and the private have got to be balanced. He had at least 2 emotional breakdowns in his life, one big one in the early 1850s. Why? I try to get at that as best one can. And by the way, I tried to humanize and tell the story of Anna, his first wife, as best I could, even though she never wrote a word. And one of the most amazing, my favorite moments in a year that has been transcendent because of this book, I've been, I don't know, hundreds of book talks, hinder and yon, was 2 weeks ago I was in Richmond. And an African-American woman walked up to, I'm sitting by myself having breakfast in a hotel, and there's nobody else there. A woman walks up to me in her running suit. She'd been out running or walking. She said, "Do you mind if I sit down?" And I probably said something like, "I guess so." She's a writer. Marita Golden, I didn't know her. She said, "I just have to tell you, you humanized Anna in your book. And thank you." And she gave me a hug. And before she left, we were both crying. It might have been the bad scrambled eggs, but it's my favorite moment so far out there. The second marriage to Helen Pitts was a white woman, 20 years younger, was by far the most scandalous marriage of the 19th century. I'll leave that there. One entire Evans scrapbook is devoted to that marriage. Newspaper clippings. And last but not least, a 6th big theme in the book, and I draw it in as soon as he becomes a public person, is Douglass the intellectual, Douglass the artist, Douglass the writer, Douglass the thinker about constitutional law, Douglass the thinker about the notion of memory, Douglass the political theorist, and there are no less than 3 books now by political scientists, political theorists on Douglass as an advocate of the natural rights tradition. And literary critics have been all over Douglass since the 1970s. It used to be a rite of passage in black literary criticism that you had to write your book on Douglass, or you had to write your essay on Douglass's first autobiography. So, the intellectual, the artist, is there as well. Now, I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to do just one quick story as a way of ending. And it takes me back to that idea of biblical storytelling. It's 1864. The election year of 1864. Any of you who know your Civil War history at all know that's Lincoln's re-election. But there was nothing inevitable about Lincoln being re-elected. Nothing. In fact, he was in deep trouble politically that summer. The war was in total stalemate in Georgia, in Mobile Bay, in the Shenandoah Valley, and especially in the now halted overland campaign around Pittsburgh in Virginia. The casualties were horrific. By that point in the summer of '64, the war weariness across the North was terrible. There was every reason to believe by July and August that Lincoln would not win that fall against the Democratic candidate who was going to be George McClellan, the general Lincoln had fired in the fall of 1862 after the Antietam campaign. The Democrats were running on a peace platform, which has never been perfectly clear, but on some level they were going to engage, if they won, in some kind of negotiated settlement with the Confederacy. Lincoln called Douglass to the White House in Washington in August of '64, 3rd week of August. That's the second time they met. The first time they met was 1 year earlier in August of '63, when Douglass went to Washington to protest against all the discriminations against black soldiers. Douglass didn't have an invitation that first time, and he barely got into the office for 40 minutes. But this time, the president invites him because he wanted to throw a trial balloon up at Douglass, the spokesman of black America, the most important voice of abolitionism and so on. But here's what he really asked Douglass to do. And Douglass was stunned. He said, Mr. Douglass, I want you to be the chief agent of a system that will funnel as many slaves out of the upper South into the North behind Union lines and to some degree of legal freedom before Election Day in November, in case I'm not reelected. I want slavery as damaged as possible before the Democrats take over. I don't know exactly what Douglass thought, but I'm sure he must have had some reaction like, sure, happy to help. He had no clue how he was supposed to do this. He was just told, oh, the Army and the War Department will help you set it up, which they never did. He went back to Rochester, New York. He started sending telegrams and letters to all sorts of friends, people who'd been involved in recruiting black soldiers, old abolitionist pals of his. And for about 10 days, he was trying to organize something. He wasn't sure how they were supposed to do this. And he was, of course, saved by the turning points in the war, especially the fall of Atlanta. September 2nd or 3rd of '64, the news came that Sherman had taken Atlanta. It was as big a news as the war had ever had. It had a tremendous impact on Northern morale. And then there was the news, even earlier, that Admiral Farragut had taken Mobile Bay on August 25th, in the largest naval engagement of the war. And then there was news that Sheridan was moving down through the Shenandoah Valley and burning everything in his wake. And the morale of the North, the political prospects of this election just changed because of events. Now, the Democrats were running, as I always tell my students, the most racist campaign in American political history until the next one, because the '68 one was even worse. But the Democrats at that point, the parties have shifted a lot over time, as many of you know. The Democrats of '64 were running a white supremacist campaign. They were painting the Republicans as the party of emancipation. That's classic politics. You want a wedge issue in 1864? The Republican Party is now the party of black emancipation. The Emancipation Proclamation is a year and a half old. Black soldiers are serving all over the war. This is a war to end slavery. And the Democrats went to the polls saying, well, they called Lincoln Abraham Africanus I, implying that he was black. They employed the N-word all the time. Douglass wanted to campaign for Lincoln, but they wouldn't let him. The Republican Party wouldn't let him. They didn't want the greatest black spokesman in America out there campaigning. It was too visible. They wanted to kind of, step around the emancipation issue as much as they could in this election, even though that's what they stand for. But here's what Douglass did do. On election night in '64, first week in November, and by the way, I got this out of a clipping in the Evans scrapbooks. It's priceless. I only have one source for this, but man, I went with it. On election night in Rochester, I got this from a clipping of a guy who wrote a reminiscence about Douglass in 1881 in a Rochester newspaper. There were a lot of these. The day I did this with Douglass and the day I did that with Douglass. This guy claimed on election day he was the poll taker that put Douglass's ballot in the box. Ooh. And then he said he and Douglass walked back into the center of town that night to go to the telegraph office and check out the returns. And he said a group of 4 or 5 drunken white thugs came out of an alleyway and they challenged Douglass to a fight. And according to this witness, Douglass put up his fists and said, "Come on, let's have it." And the drunken thugs scurried away into the alley, as we're told. But more importantly, the next Sunday, and here's my point, Douglass went where he had gone so many times in Rochester. He went to the Spring Street AME Church, a black Methodist church in Rochester. The Sunday after the election, Lincoln has been reelected. He could have that pulpit anytime he wanted it. He had given whole lecture series at Spring Street over the years, usually on Sunday afternoons. He went there that Sunday and he opened, because he knew his audience would know it, packed church. He opened with the story of Noah's Ark. He told the story. He said, you know, Noah stopped the ark because the ark went aground. Noah begins to wonder, could it be? Is the flood over? So Noah sent a dove out of the ark, and the dove comes back with an olive branch in its beak. And Noah wondered, is it possible? So Noah sent the dove out again, and the dove does not return. So Noah decided to take the tarps off the top of the ark, and lo, the world had been reborn. It was green. What's he just done? He doesn't get up and say, hooray for Lincoln. He tells the oldest rebirth story in Western civilization to make his audience feel what this rebirth might be. He went to Genesis. But that isn't all he did. He announced that day that the following Sunday he was going to go to Baltimore for the first time since he escaped in 1838. He hadn't been back except on a train that went through Baltimore. He never got off. He said, I'm going back to Baltimore because the state of Maryland had just held a referendum to vote whether to become a free state. And by a narrow margin, something like 12,000, no, it was 20,900 to 20,200 or something. It was unbelievably close. Maryland had voted to be a free state. And Douglass said, I'm going home to the free soil of Baltimore, Maryland. And he did, following Sunday. And this time he has paparazzi in tow. It's how we know what happened. There were like 3 reporters with him. Where'd he go? To Fells Point, where he'd grown up as a slave, and he went to the Bethel AME Church on Dallas Street in Fells Point, a black church in Baltimore, another packed house. They couldn't even get the people into the place. He walks up to the church, and who meets him on the front steps? But his sister, Eliza. She's like 3 years older. He hadn't seen her since 1836. She had become free in the late 1850s by the purchase of her own freedom. She had had 8 children and named one of them for her famous brother. He took her by the arm. They walked up the main aisle of the church. We're told that the pulpit was surrounded by American flags. Try to envision this. And Douglass began the speech again with Noah's Ark. But it had a new twist. He tells the story. Noah sends the dove out. The dove comes back. Branch in the beak. Noah sends the dove out. No dove. Take the tarp off. Lo. But then he said, but today that I am on the free soil of Maryland, I am the dove. I am the rainbow on the sky. I am the dove, the messenger. Now that takes chutzpah. To put yourself into the Noah's Ark story and get away with it? But look what he's just done. He's not only employed that oldest rebirth metaphor in Western civilization, but he's woven his country, his people, and himself right into the middle of it. Thank you. Now, I'm told we're the last event of the day, so they might let us run 5 or so minutes over. So if we have questions, please.
Would you be willing to run on the Democratic ticket?
I assume that's a question for him. No.
So, That was a very good question. Let's
stick
to the protocol of the microphones, and we'll call. There's another microphone over there, so we'll start here and then over there. You stand up, please.
Professor Blight, I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
Question for you. How did you first come to Douglass? And the other question, which may not be so polite, I always wonder, how does a white guy fall in love with a black guy that way and dedicates a huge chunk of his life to exploring him?
The second part of that question is simple. Because he's so important. He's so important in American history. He doesn't belong to anybody. He belongs to all of us. You can't put Douglass in any boxes. He'll squirm right out of them. We should all, in our educations, our learning, our teaching, be trying to cross every boundary we can, as often as we can. The first question is also fairly simple. I came of age in the late 1960s, early 70s. I took the first ever Black History course taught at Michigan State. It was, yay. Go Sparty. They're getting their tail kicked today by Penn State. I checked the score 30 seconds before I came out here. It was taught by Les Rout, who was African American. He was a Brazilianist by training. I mean, Les wrote books about Juan Perón and modern Brazil, but in 1968 or 69, whichever year that was, they no doubt went to Les and said, Les, teach a course on Black America. You're black. And he did, and it was great. I still have the notes. But then I was a high school teacher in the 1970s in Flint, where I grew up. We were creating courses in Black history without knowing, frankly, much of what we were doing. We were using sources that weren't terribly adequate, but I still have the poster of Douglass that I had in that classroom in Flint up in my apartment, and the reason I kept it is because of two things. It has his inaccurate birth date, and it has a middle initial of E. I don't know where they got that. It's like having a baseball card with an error on it, and makes it far more valuable. I don't know. And I got captured by Douglass's language, the words. I don't know when. I can't point to a moment in time. I didn't even read Douglass in college that I know of. Maybe in Les Rout's course we read some excerpt of the narrative, but I didn't really read Douglass until I was a high school teacher. And I went to graduate school determined to write about abolitionism, especially black abolitionism, and that's when I landed on Douglass. And I was trying to get him out of my life ever since until Walter Evans got in the way.
Opposite side over there.
Yes. Thank you. You need a microphone, though, if you can get one.
Good evening. I was wondering, since Frederick Douglass is so firmly in the tradition of Black liberation theology, what Black liberation theologians have you been in conversation with as you were putting together this biography?
Cone. God, what was Cone's first name? He's since deceased. Help me out. James Cone. James Cone. Man, I'm trying to think. The guy who wrote "There Is a River." Oh God, that's terrible. I reviewed the book. You'd think I'd remember. God, I'll think of it in a second. And others, I think I probably read some people not knowing if they're black or white. But I read a lot of James Cone, and I remember Don Shriver, my Sherpa at Union Theological, telling me to read Cone. The theologians were only a help to me to a certain degree. I had to actually read a lot of the Bible. And thank God for Google these days. And you see a passage, in anything, and it sort of seems biblical, you put it into Google and it'll show you where, usually. Vincent, yes. And I met Vincent several times. Vincent Harding, who's also deceased now. Vincent wrote a history called There Is a River back in the 70s, but he also wrote a lot of formal theology, black liberation theology. He was a civil rights activist, in fact, part of Martin Luther King's lieutenants. Yeah.
We've got one over here.
Would you take a minute to talk about his encounters in Chicago with the Underground Railroad, John Jones, Charles Volney Dyer, John Brown, some of those activities?
Well, sure. Douglass had many associations with Chicago and with Illinois and everywhere else in the Midwest. If there's a train line in the northern states, he wrote on it. He spoke many, many times in Chicago. He was in Chicago during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. That was a revelation to me. Another young scholar who was at my center at Yale started telling me about this. But Douglass was in Illinois and may have attended at least one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And so when Stephen Douglas starts saying Abe Lincoln, is riding around in carriages with Fred Douglass, which is all nonsense, but maybe it's because Douglass knew he was around. Now, the Underground Railroad, well, first of all, hardly anybody called it that at the time. But Douglass had many associations with John Brown, including on that trek that John Brown made out of Missouri and Kansas, across Iowa, across Illinois to Chicago, and across Michigan to Detroit in 1858 in the dead of winter, before he ushered, was it 6 or 7 fugitive slaves across the Detroit River into Canada. Douglass actually met in Detroit on that occasion with Brown. I counted 11 times that Douglass met with Brown in about a 10 to 11 year period. I have an entire chapter in the book about that relationship. I don't know. I could try to remember some Chicago area abolitionists and fill in on that, but they're not popping into the brain at the moment. He lectured all over the Midwest, as far north as Traverse City, Michigan. He went into Wisconsin and Minnesota. He went as far west as Colorado. And after the war, he went all over the Deep South, too, which was another revelation of of the Evans scrapbooks. I had never realized Douglass went to the Deep South as much as he did. And of course, Douglass attended a number of Republican conventions in Chicago. He campaigned for every Republican president from, well, if you count 64, from 64 on. Every one of them. In season and out. Sometimes against his best judgment. Yes, sir. Right there?
Microphone right over there.
Do you have the mic?
We have time for 2 quick ones, if we can. We're already a little over, so.
To expand upon that just a little bit, can you speak about his relationship with Lincoln, what he really thought of Lincoln, and how that changed over time?
Well, on my list of all those questions, I have like 100 questions on this crazy list that I think most biographers have in their head. I actually have it on a piece of paper. If I ever could get Douglass in a seminar room, lock the doors, I got at least 4 hours with him with no bathroom breaks. One of my questions is going to be, Mr. Lincoln, Mr. Douglass, what did you really think of Lincoln? At this stage, that stage, and that stage. Their relationship was nothing until the middle of the war. They met 3 times, 63 in August, 64 in August, and then at the second inaugural. Maybe you know this. There is no 4th meeting, although that was out there in the atmosphere for a while. Lincoln invited Douglass to have tea at the soldiers' home in D.C., where Lincoln would go for respite, and other presidents did as well, between the inaugural and the assassination. And Douglass had a speaking engagement, had to turn it down. And later, of course, wished he'd gone. That would have been a much probably longer and more substantial meeting, and a very different kind of meeting. Their relationship, though, was bitter. Well, they didn't have any relationship until '63. But Douglass was a ferocious critic of Lincoln in the first year and a half of the war. He called him some things some people don't even like to hear. He called him the most powerful slave catcher in the land. And when Lincoln met with those 5 black ministers in D.C. in August of '62 and made a very public thing about it by inviting in the press, where he's inviting these so-called black leaders, none of whom were prominent, to become the leaders of a colonization scheme to remove black people from the country. And he said to their faces, without your people in our land, we would not have this war. Douglass went ballistic after that. But what he didn't know is, you know, the bit of a puppeteer in Lincoln had already written the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, had it in the drawer at the War Department. Although the colonization schemes by the Lincoln administration were real, they were not just ruses. What changes his views of Lincoln, and I'll leave it there, is that preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September '62, and then especially 100 days later, the final proclamation, especially the fact that there are 2 parts of the final proclamation that were not in the first. One is, in effect, the order for the recruiting of black soldiers and sailors, and the second is colonization is nowhere mentioned. And by the way, here, I'll put that photo up here. When I can come back, oops, uh-oh, I just lost. Oh, okay, here. Sorry, but there he is. After the Emancipation Proclamation is signed, January 1st, 1863, Douglass was famously in Boston for the Watch Night, incredible celebration at Tremont Temple. He took the train home to Rochester, published his little editorial that said a day for poetry and song, which he'd already written before he went to Boston. And then he did what he always did. And I should have said this earlier. Douglass was one of those people, like probably a lot of you and us. He didn't always know what he thought about something until he could go to his desk and write it down. Maybe an editorial, maybe an essay, maybe a speech. He went back to Rochester, went to his desk, and wrote a speech called The Proclamation and the Negro Army. He took it out on the road, gave it dozens and dozens of times, and it became the template for his recruiting speech for black soldiers. This photograph was taken in Hillsdale, Michigan, over in southern Michigan, in late January 1863, when he's out giving this speech. And that speech has a line in it that is amazing. It says, this proclamation frees all of us. It frees the Confederate soldier. It frees the white Union soldier. It will free the black Union soldier. It frees slaves. It frees white Northerners and white Southerners. It frees America from itself. Now, did that proclamation do all those things alone? No, it's a legal document. It's an executive order. It's written in not Lincoln's best prose. But Douglass had a point. Emancipation, eventually, freed the country from its past, if it could choose to be. Now, what he did with Lincoln eventually is he created about 3 different kinds of Lincolns in different eulogy speeches at different times. I wrote an essay about that once, about Douglass and Lincoln, the relationship, but mostly about their relationship through words and language. He created 3 very different kinds of Lincolns at different times. And just like he did with John Brown, he once said John Brown is far more valuable dead on the cross, meaning the gallows, than he had ever been alive. This is a brutal thing to say, but it was true. And in a sense, Lincoln's martyrdom made him useful over time. We might take one more here if it's quick.
We are out
no, we
of
won't.
time,
I guess we won't.
unfortunately.
That's right.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Blight.